One of the biggest problems in the video game industry is publishers who hold their intellectual property hostage. And that's basically when they refuse to make a sequel or a follow-up to one of their hit franchises they have under their belt. Now, you could argue that you could run into the opposite problem where you're like Ubisoft or Activision, where you just keep releasing annual slop over and over again. Well, I would argue that the reverse of this problem is when you can go decades at a time without ever updating some of your old games in your catalog. And I find that a problem because some of these older franchises out there have unique and distinct gameplay loops that we never really see even in today's day and age. And if you revisit them, then we can make gaming better for the future. But out of all the developers and publishers out there, the most egregious offender on this list has to be Microsoft, at least with Nintendo. Whenever they hold one of their intellectual property hostage, at least they usually have one of the developers of that original franchise still on staff, and they usually have a say in if that game comes out. It's kind of like a Game of Thrones situation where they have a title or a legitimate heir to the throne. But with Microsoft, they're more like a Genghis Khan situation where they just storm the front gates and buy up all the intellectual property in sight and then proceed to do absolutely nothing with it. And let me tell you, I have a huge vendetta against Microsoft. Now, growing up, I was a Nintendo fanboy, and that's mainly because Nintendo consoles were the only consoles that my parents would actually buy me. And that was pretty typical back in the day. You know, most middle-class families could only maybe afford one or two consoles at most because video games are an expensive hobby to take part of. And Microsoft bought out Rare in September 24th, 2002. They outbid both Activision and Nintendo by a lot, purchasing the company for over $375 million in cash. That was a real kick in the nuts because Rare's audience at the time was really established with Nintendo. And Rare games were my favorite video games to play on the Nintendo 64. They were just that established with the Nintendo brand at that point in time. Like, if you were playing a Nintendo game back then, you were probably playing a Rare game. And some of the hit classics were GoldenEye 64, Banjo Kazooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Killer Instinct. The list goes on and on. And Rare was so popular because of their ability to create new intellectual properties and create classics out of them. And Banjo Tooie in particular is one of my childhood favorites. That game is the Elden Ring of my childhood. And not in terms of difficulty, but in size, scope, and skill. Like, the main campaign for Banjo Tooie is gigantic and chock full of content. And you could easily get lost just exploring in that game. Like, there's like 5 different overworlds. Every level in that game is huge and vast. And there were so many different modes in this game. Like, there is Mario Party depth in their minigame collection. They have a scuffed first-person shooter mode where you can play basically a bargain bin version of GoldenEye. There's just so much content jam-packed in this game. So you can imagine my disdain after finding out I wouldn't be able to play Rare games. Now, you would imagine that Microsoft, after spending so much money purchasing Rare, would actually treat these intellectual properties with huge respect. But what happened was they ran that intellectual property in the ground and then proceeded to do absolutely nothing with them. The most we got out of Banjo Kazooie was Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, which was a spin-off game that nobody asked for and completely bombed. And I'd also like to add on that Nuts and Bolts was made with complete disdain of the original audience of Banjo Kazooie. They made a remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day, which a lot of people say is good, but they never touched the brand ever again. And that's a big problem with Microsoft. They don't make sense as a company. They spend over $375 million in cash and then proceed to not use any of the properties that they purchased. It doesn't make any logical sense to me. I kind of feel like companies like Microsoft and other giant publishers out there just view video game franchises and intellectual properties as names in a hat that have an obscure amount of value. They kind of view these things as some kind of cryptocurrency asset that holds value for some undiscernible reason because the people that are running these companies aren't actual fans of video games. They don't play video games and they don't understand why they hold value other than the fact that other people like them and other companies own them. And that's a huge problem. What's even more surprising is the fact that not everybody at Microsoft is completely brain dead, because back in 2013, they actually decided to do something with one of the rare properties that they owned. They released Killer Instinct 2013, and it was one of the best fighting games of that generation, and it was a console seller. And that's a big deal because Microsoft doesn't really have a lot of exclusive content anymore. They have Halo and Master Chief and maybe Gears of War, and that's about it. And the one time they actually had exclusive content, it's when they went back to the well and actually used their rare properties. So again, this is just baffling to me because they're sitting on a pot of gold. They know it can make them money, and they never do anything with it. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know who's running this company anymore. And then we have Nintendo. And while I was a huge fanboy of Nintendo growing up, I'm not anymore. And I kind of feel like a lot of people take it easy on Nintendo because they have a lot of fond childhood memories playing their consoles, but I kind of think it's time to take the gloves off and tackle one of the biggest problems Nintendo has, and that's sitting on all of their best intellectual property. I'm just going to get the obvious one out of the way since I've already went on a huge rant about this in one of my previous videos, but Nintendo has done nothing with the Earthbound/Mother franchise. The last mainline game in this series came out in 2006, and that was Mother 3, and we have yet to get a proper English official localization. The only way to play that game is illegally over the internet, and that kind of sucks, and it's a huge letdown. It's also even more jarring and surprising considering the fact that a lot of indie games owe their inspiration to the Mother franchise. I'm looking at Undertale and Lisa in particular, and I understand that there's a little bit of tension between Nintendo and the original creator of the Mother series, but that doesn't excuse them for, at the very least, not just making a spiritual successor to the series, especially when so many people want to play that game and that franchise. And then we have F-Zero. And F-Zero is a fast-paced, futuristic racing game where you go faster than the speed of sound. And I kind of feel like that's an underutilized and underserved genre. But the last mainline game in the series was F-Zero GX for the Nintendo GameCube. And that's also one of my favorite games of all time. I also like previous games in the entries. Like I loved F-Zero X, since that game had this really awesome heavy metal soundtrack. And I kind of feel like Nintendo doesn't have a legitimate reason for not making another F-Zero game. Like at this point in time, Captain Falcon is more of a Super Smash Brothers character than a racing game character. Like that's just the state of things at the moment. And the main reason why Nintendo hasn't made a new mainline F-Zero game is because they believe they can't think of any way to innovate the formula. Nintendo's excuse as to why they won't make a new F-Zero game is the exact same reason why Valve and Gabe Newell refuses to make a Half-Life 3, in that both of these development studios are hyper-fixated on breaking new ground and innovating on the formula. But I would argue, after a certain period of time, you have a license to just make a generic sequel that just updates the controls and the visuals. I understand that's not new and creative, but after 20 years, that's the amount of time that's passed since the last mainline F-Zero game, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just want to play our old classics, but updated and modern. That's all we're asking for at this point in time. And the downside of not making any new F-Zero games is that fast-paced futuristic racing is practically a dead genre, and that's unfortunate. Nintendo neglects so many franchises that there are too many to go over, so I'll just cover some ones that personally rub me the wrong way. I've been playing a lot of Wario-like games like Pizza Tower and Anton Blast, and Nintendo refuses to do anything with the Wario brand besides making mini-game slop collections. That kind of drives me nuts, and Wario is probably one of my favorite evil versions of the good guys out there, in that his games are so unique and distinct from Mario. Wario Land is an amazing game, and you should play it now. Wario used to even get 3D games. Remember when he had that 3D game for the GameCube, and it doesn't seem to be happening anymore. Golden Sun seems to be completely dead now. They haven't made a game since the Nintendo DS, and there are more games to cover for Nintendo. And finally, we have Capcom. And Capcom is probably the biggest studio in Japan that isn't Nintendo themselves, and they definitely have a reputation for neglecting their franchises. But it does seem that they plan on turning that trend around. Recently at the Video Game Awards, they announced that they would be doing a follow-up sequel to Okami, which is surprising because Okami was always a niche classic, but it was definitely a good game, and it definitely deserves a classic. Well, that being said, they definitely neglect the ever-loving hell out of their franchises. Breath of Fire used to be one of their flagship JRPG series, and I have some fond memories playing Breath of Fire 3. One of my favorite things to do in that game was just experiment with Ryu's different dragon transformations and just seeing what I would end up getting. It was definitely a really good video game series. Beautiful Joe. Now, I kind of feel like Capcom hasn't made a follow-up to Beautiful Joe 2 because it's always been a little pet project for Hideki Kamiya, and he's no longer working at the company, but I'm surprised that they haven't at least tried to reach out to him. He doesn't work at Platinum Games anymore, so they definitely have the opportunity moving forward. Dino Crisis. Now, again, I've never played a Dino Crisis game, but I've always been aware that it has a huge cult following. How cool would it be if Capcom announced that they would be making a new Dino Crisis game? I have a feeling that if they did that live in front of an audience, people would be popping off more than when Ridley was revealed for Smash Brothers. And finally, we have Mega Man Legends. Mega Man Legends has a huge cult following, but what is really surprising to me is that Capcom hasn't made more attempts to make Mega Man work in 3D. Mega Man is a character who's known for running, jumping, and shooting. And those are all things that we've pretty much established that we know how to do in 3D gaming. Vanquish and the game Cloud Built have a pretty good formula to what a good Mega Man X game would play like in 3D, and I'm surprised that Capcom hasn't attempted to do this anymore. And after all is said and done, these are just some key highlights I could think of developers and publishers who completely neglect their intellectual property, but they're almost too many to cover. So let me know in the comments what developers and publishers are neglecting one of your favorite childhood classics. With that being said, I'm the Gaming Grappler, and I'll see you next time.